Hello there, and welcome to the very last episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter for 2021. Of course, we'll be back next Friday night, next week, for another episode. But of course, this week and last week, the episodes have been going up on Thursday just because of the holidays. And there's also been a little bonus episode. So if you didn't catch that, comparing life in Italy to life in Portugal, or maybe one thing very specifically, two things. Be sure to check out that episode on YouTube. If you're listening in on the audio-only podcast, come on over, youtube.com/Rafael di Furia. But this week, what I want to talk about is reflecting on the past just shy of 5 years, and especially because it's getting to the end of the year now, and thinking about this past year and the past practically 5 years of what my life has looked like, how it's changed me, maybe what I would have done differently as well. But before we get into the rest of this episode, a huge thank you to those of you who help to make these episodes possible through rafaeldifuria.com/Patreon, shop.rafaeldifuria.com, and rafaeldifuria.com/support. Really, again, thank you so much to the Patreon supporters, those of you who bought the shirts, mugs, onesies, and more, as well as those of you who sent the one-time donations. Really, thank you also very, very much for helping this project to be able to continue. But I think it's about time we get this episode started, so roll that intro. Of course, the first thing that you have to consider when you're moving to any country is that you are not going to change the place. The place will be the one that changes you. You can't think about that, oh, I come from this country where things work, or things do this, or things are like that, or I have these preferences and I know what's right. You can't do that. You have to realize that you will be the one that will be changed. Or if you're not even open to that change, don't even bother getting on the plane. That may sound very blunt, and I'm sure there's going to be plenty of people who will agree, but if you're not going to embrace the place where you're going, why bother? Okay, fine, maybe you have to do it for work, but it almost seems like a bit of a waste if you don't take that opportunity, because that's what living abroad is, an opportunity to get something new in your life, to get to know a different way of living. Okay, maybe you don't take on everything, but there will be those little things that as time goes on that will end up changing within you and how you see the world around you. And one of those things for me, and I won't say necessarily that this was only specifically Italy, but living abroad in general, but more so that Italy brought this out in me, is that generally speaking, I have a tendency to be more of an introvert, happy to spend time on my own. And not that it means I'm shy. Introvert doesn't mean that like, oh, I can't talk to people. No, it's fine. It's just the way that I recharge is that I'm very happy to be on my own. But to be a little bit more extroverted in some ways, to push myself to be out there a little bit more. Again, if you're going to be living abroad, it's a shame not to take advantage of that opportunity and to get to know people, to get to know the way of life, to speak with locals, to talk to them, to learn about the place and learn about it through their eyes, not just through an expat bubble, through the expat experience, because that's a filter that may or may not be accurate to what things are actually like in that place. This is, again, one of the reasons why I do have those mixed opinions on expat bubbles, and why, for my experience in Italy, I did try to stay away from them for the most part. After having spent this past nearly 5 years there, this was maybe one of the things that I would have changed, that I maybe would have gone to a place that had a bit more of an expat community, because it is nice to be able to speak your own language from time to time and not be forced to always speak a language that is less familiar to you. But even with that said, being forced to put myself out there and forced to have these different experiences that I might not have otherwise was fantastic. And it's definitely going to be one of those things that stays with me, and to put myself out there. Even I've been in a number of situations in Italy where people would just strike up a conversation with me. Again, this is not specific to Italy, and this has happened to me in other places, but what I saw in Italy was that I ended up taking this on a little bit more, that this became a little bit more of how I approach things around me. It could be something where you're just at the store and you're both waiting at the counter and you're both wanting to get the same thing. Who knows? Silly things like that. And it's something that to me is more of what I think of like how things maybe would have been like 70 years ago, 60 years ago, 80, I don't know. Like the world that my grandparents would talk about, where people might actually say hello when you're walking down the street. Somebody you don't even know. That was very strange to me, especially like my generation having grown up on the West Coast. Like, you say hello to somebody, that's then something's a little bit wrong up there. Stranger danger and all that stuff. Something that I also saw in Italy was the behaviors, and certain behaviors that I think I grew up with, but maybe tried to suppress a little bit, or traditions or ways of being. And this is something that I know children of immigrants and grandchildren of immigrants and so on go through, that there are maybe those little cultural differences that you see that, oh, my family's just weird. And you don't realize that it's actually something that's maybe normal in another part of the world. And so there are those things that even like a few generations down the line, that for me were like, oh, my family's weird. Like when I was a kid, I was just like, it was almost like embarrassing. I got to Italy, I'm like, oh, this is something that people just do here. I mean, and of course, that I'm talking about this right now off the top of my head, I can't think of a great example, but just something simple and stupid that I've mentioned before in previous episodes is about going out with wet hair. My grandfather, like I've mentioned plenty of times, would flip out if I came out of the shower and didn't immediately dry my hair bone dry. That was very much a thing growing up, especially when I was very little, because it's concerning. You could get sick. You could catch a cold. It might be 1,000,000 degrees outside, but you don't want to have that wet hair. That's dangerous. But even talking about some of those behaviors, I think there's something in Italy where people have had to become innovative and creative in how to go through daily life, because you do have a lot of bureaucracy, or you have paperwork. Bureaucracy, same thing. But there will be processes that you have. Bureaucracy. I keep saying bureaucracy in 5 different ways. But even just with how things are done, just the accepted way of how life is processed, there is an ebb and flow that you do have to become accustomed to there. There are certain things that they're just done that way simply because they're done that way. But something that I also was brought up with, maybe when one door closes, that doesn't mean that it's the only door. That there are often plenty of other routes to get where you're trying to go. Maybe it's not going to look exactly like how you thought it would, but the end goal or the end result may end up being roughly the same. And so in Italy, there are those times where you do have to look for those alternatives, or what you can do. And I'm saying still within the legal system and doing things legally. Even if you're trying to get a bank account and maybe they say, no, you don't have X, Y, and Z. Well, say, hey, I have A, B, and C. And sometimes just trying to open up a bank account and offering that alternative to what they're asking for may just be good enough in some situations. And there are other aspects of life where that can apply as well. Even recently, somebody messaged me who's a student now in Italy, and the people at the bank were telling him that, oh, you have to have a carta d'identità to be able to open up a bank account. But to me, that's very strange. Like, you don't necessarily have to have that, because you'd only really have that if you're a citizen anyway. So what you could do is show them your passport. I mean, it should be good enough in many places. I know of people who've done that. So it's surprising to me that there are sometimes these situations where you can only do it one way. There's only this one way of doing things. But no, there are various ways to go about that. So I think this is also another thing that's kind of affected me, and to approach life in a different way. Again, it's in line with how I grew up, but it's also, I felt myself really having to embrace this in Italy just because of how things work there. But something else that you see in Italy a lot, innovation when it comes to food, when it comes to tech, when it comes to food, and more food, wine, technically food. But really though, jokes aside, what you see the Italians doing to push food forward, to make quality food, and to embrace the natural flavors and not add so many additives and preservatives, even though you do see this. There are a lot of people that have the idea, oh, in Italy, they don't use preservatives and they don't use the chemicals and they don't use the this and the that. No, it's a normal country. It's a modern world. People have supermarkets. It's not like everybody's going down to the farmer and getting their vegetables from that guy. No, that's the old idea of what Italy may have been at one time, but Italy does live in the modern world. So even before living in Italy, I had never used any of these like food ordering apps, or I'd used Amazon in America years ago, but Amazon Prime, for example, that was something I never even thought of. And in Italy, it's like 36 euros for the whole year. So like decent price, especially if you need to be ordering from there. And that was something that during lockdown, I had to embrace that. There was really no other option. You couldn't go to the stores. And not only could you not go to the stores, there were pretty much no stores open other than supermarkets and pharmacies. But even then, you really, during part of the events of, we'll call 2020, early part of 2020, just because, again, YouTube, if you talk about certain things and use certain words and blah, 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 video gets pegged down, channel gets pegged down. So we'll just call it 2020 in the events of. And so during part of that, there was a point in time where we could only go, I think, about 200 meters from our homes. And for those of you not familiar with meters, 200 yards is almost the same thing, just a little bit different. That's very close, and only you could go past that if the supermarket was just outside of that range. But then the other thing was that a lot of restaurants locally that didn't ever offer delivery services before had to start offering them just so they could keep afloat. And so again, it was that changing with the times, innovation. Not that necessarily using an app was innovative, but for a place that didn't really embrace it before, at least where I had been living, it was really interesting to see that. But then even the approach regarding the cafes and so on, before 2020, the cafe seating area outdoors was very, very small. And again, also inside was quite small as well. But in 2020, a lot of places expanded dramatically because there was no indoor seating allowed at a certain point. So they gave permission for a lot more outdoor seating, even places that didn't really have that indoor seating to begin with. So that was really cool to get to see, to how there was the change with the time and to try and make it work within what had been given. So that's something that you also see in Italy, that you have to be creative with how you go about things, because sometimes just the way that the system works isn't necessarily something that really helps you along. So you have to figure out how to accomplish certain things, or how to build, whatever it is that you need to get done. And even if you're needing to go shopping, I mean, for where I lived in a small city in the Veneto, there were plenty of things that were not available locally. So again, it came down to my having to embrace Amazon, something that I hadn't really done before in my life, because when I left America, there was Amazon, but it wasn't the Amazon like we have today. Seeing all the innovation around me, that's something that I really embrace, that no matter what's going on, I always have to keep pushing forward. I'm not going to let something stop me. And it's something that I'm genuinely embracing in my life, that there has to be this innovation of how you push forward. Another thing, though, that I really want to talk about is patience, because of how things work in Italy. Sometimes you have to hurry up and wait, that you can't just keep pushing forward. So yeah, maybe not everybody's so patient out there, but for me, definitely, especially coming from an idea and having lived in other countries where things work a little bit more smoothly or a little bit more fast, things get done very quickly, I had to get used to, okay, this is Italy, this is just how things are done, and not having the expectations of how another place does something for how Italy does it. And I think this is something that just in general in life we have to have that approach with. Like, doesn't matter. Even you could be in a relationship. Just because your ex did something some way doesn't mean that your current partner should do things that way, or that you should expect that they do them that way. Or because you went to one restaurant that made chicken a certain way, you shouldn't expect the other restaurant to make chicken that exact same way. You have to treat each individual place, individual location, whatever it is, on its own merit. Or even just kind of bringing it back to the idea of the relationship. You can't blame your current person who you're with for something that your ex did, whether that was cheat or yell or whatever it could have been, whatever negative thing. You can't blame that new place, that new person, that new whatever for how you were treated in the past. You have to be in that moment and create that unique relationship based on what you have with that place. And so for me, taking the time to really slow down and appreciate that was something that I needed to do. Yes, I still found it frustrating. But once you understand certain things just work a certain way, then this is just, it will make things that little bit easier for you, less stress. And that's the most important thing, to reduce the amount of stress that you have in your life. But of course, if you're going through certain processes with anything, I don't know, an Italian office or a municipal office or a bank or a consulate, you'll know about some of the frustrations that can come up. And there will be those times where even though you do have to take that step back, you also do have to be proactive, but in the right way. You have to learn how to be proactive so that you don't annoy the person behind the counter, or to make it so that they just don't want to deal with your paperwork and stuff it at the bottom of their stack that they have to deal with. This is something that, like, when going through Italian citizenship and all the people that I've spoken with, I don't help people with the process, but because of this project, there are a lot of you who reach out to me. And so there are a lot of you who've told me that you will have contacted them repeatedly and bothered them. It's like, no, that's exactly what you don't want to do. Contacting them so frequently, something that you really would like to avoid. Only do it when absolutely necessary. Yeah, okay, if the process is taking long, yeah, you can check in, see what's going on and see how things are going, but you have to remain polite and calm because they don't have to give you an update. You can just check in and be nice and friendly. And maybe if you're lucky, maybe they'll say, hey, yeah, I'm going to get to it in the next because I know this, that, and the other. Anyway, long, different story for a different day, but you have to have that approach in Italy as well. And not just when you're dealing with things in an official capacity, but even in daily life. And it could be as simple as trying to get a product from your local grocer that maybe they don't have it one day and you have to wait till they bring it in a month. Or even there was one point, I wanted marshmallows. I was in the mood. And so I went to the local store, bought a couple, and it just so happened to be the last couple that were there on the shelf. They didn't have marshmallows again. I don't know how many months it was, because even before I left, I checked and they still didn't have any. So you might find those situations where you have to be a little proactive and say, hey, when are you going to be getting them again? Not just like expecting that the order will come in with them. But I do see that this episode has gotten a little bit on the long side. So maybe rather than getting into what I would have done differently in this episode, maybe I'll save that for a future episode. Let me know if you're interested in that, and we can revisit this subject again. Because I can say that there are maybe certain decisions that I would have made differently based on what I know now. I mean, of course, hindsight is always 20/20. But would it have been different? That's a 50-50. Would life have actually been different? Would it have been better? Would it have been worse? It's impossible to know, because we can only know what is here in the moment. Because the only thing that we know is definitely for certain is the past. What could have happened, we don't know. What the future will be, we don't know. The only time we ever know what the future will look like is once it's already passed us by. So, of course, thank you all so much for joining me for another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. Look forward to seeing you all next year. Stay safe and healthy out there. And, of course, stay happy and healthy out there. Have a happy new year. Thank you again. Huge thank you to those of you who help to support this project and help to make these episodes possible on a monthly basis, just one time, or through the shirts, mugs, onesies, and more. Thank you all so very, very much, because it is so very greatly appreciated. Of course, I am Rafael di Furia, and I will see you all next year. Later.